lesson is on Unit 6, Chapters 10 and 11 on Industry and Services. This unit opens with the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution, which happens or begins in Great Britain in the mid to late 1700s. Why does this happen? Well, because of the flow of capital or essentially, money and resources. It also was sparked by the Second Agricultural Revolution, mercantilism and cottage industries, resources like coal, iron ore, and water power for energy, and then the diffusion of railways. You can also see a map here that indicates how the railways are also associated with the spread of industry. When we look at the distribution of industry, we see that 3/4 of the world's manufacturing is clustered in 3 regions: Europe, North America, and China. When we use the term infrastructure, we're typically referring to man-made structures that are vast and very elaborate. And so they usually also serve a great deal of people, also helping connect different regions or areas. So, for example, we've got roads, airports, ports, railways, energy or energy systems, utilities, education, healthcare, and then, of course, social infrastructure buildings like arenas. Talk about industry and service, we often associate that with globalization. And to understand globalization, you also need to know how to categorize countries according to their where they're situated in the global economy. And so we can look to our core nations, which tend to be more high income, they're industrialized, they tend to control the global markets, have skilled labor forces, and need labor and natural resources from periphery and semi-periphery countries. So they're usually outsourcing a lot of these very labor-intensive jobs. We can also look to our periphery nations, which are more low income, less skilled labor forces. They export labor and natural resources, and they need investment or may rely on investment from other countries. And then lastly, we can look to our semi-periphery nations, which are kind of in between, middle of the road. They're more middle income, industrializing. They're mostly capitalist. They share characteristics of core and periphery countries, and they are moving toward becoming core nations. Of course, all are important and necessary in the globalized market. Periphery nations provide cheaper labor, natural resources, and core nations may also the periphery nations may be very dependent on the financial resources that are coming from core nations. To give some examples of countries that would be in the core, semi-periphery, and periphery, some core countries would include Canada, France, Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US. Semi-periphery would include China, India, Ireland, Mexico, Pakistan, and Panama. And then the periphery countries would be Afghanistan, Bolivia, Chad, the Dominican Republic, Egypt, Haiti, the Philippines, and Vietnam. So the world definitely reflects uneven development. We can see this in specific states or countries, I should say. And we can also see it from state to state, meaning country to country. So there are great disparities in levels of wealth and well-being between people in core versus your peripheral areas. This is due to globalization of the economy and the disparity that's much greater than it's ever been in the past. So yes, we do see inequities. There is there is a significant division of inequities when it comes to wealth in the United States. But if we're actually looking at that and applying that to the rest of the world, it's even greater. Map looking at core, semi-periphery, and periphery countries. The blue would be your core countries, the semi-periphery would be in the purple, and then your periphery countries would be in red. Of the services unit or chapter, deals with central place theory, and Walter Christaller developed the central place theory to explain the size and spacing of cities and how they specialize in selling goods and services. So the theory consists of two concepts. One, that there's a threshold. This is the minimum market needed to bring a firm or city selling goods and services into existence and to keep it in business. And then secondly would be range, which is the average maximum distance people are going to travel to purchase goods and services. Normally, the threshold is found within the range, as the diagram shows. Keep in mind, just the number associated with the population size is not the only factor to consider. You may also want to take into account income levels and where a certain type of business would actually flourish and do well. Model from this unit includes Weber's model, or the least cost theory. And so this was, Weber was a German economist who published the theory of the location of industries in 1909. And the theory was the industrial equivalent of the von Thunen model. So looking at manufacturing plants being located where costs are the least. So there are three categories of costs: transportation costs, labor costs, and agglomeration. Agglomeration is when a group of industries cluster for mutual benefits or shared services, facilities, and this can all lead to lower costs. Segue into the concepts of bulk gaining and bulk reducing industries. So if we're talking about bulk gaining industries, that means that they add weight at the point of production of a final product. So where should these be produced? Looking at bottling companies or bottling factories, we're looking at products like beer or soda, or fabricated metals like refrigerators. Remember, since the final product is going to gain in weight, you want that to be closest to the market. Then when we have the bulk reducing industries, that means that their weight will reduce. They lose weight at the point of production, or at the point of production of that final product. So basically, if we're looking at something that ends up really heavy initially, but then once it starts to become more refined, or it becomes a final product, it is going to become much lighter. Then, of course, those products can be refined closer to the inputs rather than to the market. So with mining and smelting, for example, or paper, it would make sense that that would be produced closer to the input, so that when they're lighter in weight, they're easier and less expensive to transport. Now, this unit also deals with the concept of development, and the way that we can gauge development would be through the Human Development Index. This index is data that's collected by the United Nations. It gives us a sense of where countries are at with their life expectancy, their education systems, and then, of course, how well people are doing with standards of living. So, what is the income or GDP per capita? Also be reflected to some extent when we're looking at development through efforts by the United Nations. So here we can see the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that have been put out by the UN. They include no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice with strong institutions, and partnerships for the goals. So again, you can get into the details of what each of those goals entails. This can kind of remind you of what the purpose of the UN is, which is like two kind of really big purposes: one, preventing war and maintaining peace, and then the other would be supporting in the development and well-being of humanity. Shortcomings to the HDI. Remember, a better indicator would be the HDI adjusted for inequality. And that is because some countries may be very misleading as to how well they're doing and how they're ranked, especially if, a country like the US, for example, has a very wealthy um, people in a very small percentage that could be skewing the average GDP per capita, for example. So we can also look to measuring gender equality. So the Gender Related Development Index is one way to gauge. And then we also have gender empowerment that can be measured. So it's basically the same as the HDI, but it's more centered on gender. So it looks at economic factors like per capita income with males versus females. It also looks at education. So, what percentage of females are in school versus males in school, and what's the percentage of the literacy rate between females and males? That could be a huge indicator as to, where countries are at in their development. Obviously, the more equality you see with males and females, and the more opportunities that women have, typically that also is reflective of how developed a nation may be or country may be. I'm also looking at health, so we can look at life expectancy of females versus males. And then we can also look to gender empowerment. So this measures the ability of women to participate in the process of improvement. This can be economic or political. So what's the per capita income of males versus females? What's the percentage of women in professional or technical jobs? And then for political, what's the percentage of admin jobs held by women, meaning like managerial jobs? And then also the percentage of women in national parliament or Congress would be another word for that. So, women in policymaking positions. And again, the more opportunities there are with empowerment positions, also the more developed we see that countries tend to be. Infographic, we'll find ways that we can categorize examples that we can see as economic, social, political, or environmental. Remember, when you're taking the AP exam, you might be asked to provide two examples. You'll want to make sure that they're pretty diversified. You don't want like to invoke two environmental examples when you should be going with, again, one environmental, one economic. So again, just kind of knowing how to categorize will just ensure that you're not attempting to get, let's say, 2 points for two examples, but really they'll only count it as one because it's not diversified enough. So with that being said, some examples would include economic. That's where you're talking about jobs, labor, the workforce, economic policies, types of economies, agriculture, industry, urbanization, markets, distribution, banking, and currency. Now we can look to social. That's where you're talking about things like family, children, gender roles, ethnic groups, religion, healthcare, science, technology, migration, social classes, freedoms and rights, and maybe certain demographics related to education. You might also talk about political factors, so government, policies, laws, wars, conflict, government leaders, alliances, strategies, organizations, regional or trans-regional global structures. Then we can get to environmental. So what would you talk about if you're talking about environmental examples? Weather, climate, location, adapting, modifying, urban, suburban, rural, population distribution, population density, natural resources, natural hazards, surroundings, attitudes towards surroundings, barriers, or diseases. So, again, all of these are they should be pretty second nature to you, but categorizing them is something you'll want to work on. Have regional alliances, and so I do feel like this kind of fits into the political geography in it a bit better, but again, we see some overlap where these alliances may fit into a variety of different units actually. So the EU, supranational organization, and it again exists for economic reasons, but we're talking about European countries coming together so that they can compete with other larger countries around the world with large economies. Then you also have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, may also have expanded into Central and South America, the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that reduce tariffs and promote world trade and economic globalism, OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and other groups in Central and South America and Africa as well. And then for military and political alliances, of course, you can talk about the United Nations. You could also talk about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Yeah, so just to name a few.